Sterling Croft was screaming at a blank monitor while his security team was escorted out in zip ties. He looked at me and asked, "Who are you?" I told him. "I am the woman you deleted 10 years ago today. I am returning the favor." Sterling thought he was the architect of the future. He thought he could bankrupt 100 years of history with a single click of a mouse. He saw Zoraidé as a shadow, a ghost from the NSA archives who posed no threat to his billions. He was popping champagne while he signed the university's death warrant. He didn't realize he was signing his own confession, as Zoraidé felt her vintage brass compass vibrate against her chest. She knew the trap was set. The compass wasn't pointing north. It was locked onto the stolen servers Croft thought were invisible. He made one fatal mistake. He used an encryption protocol I wrote before he even learned to code. A protocol with a hidden sovereign key. In the next few minutes, you will see how a digital ghost turns a billionaire into a ghost. This is not a story about a computer virus. It is a masterclass in digital sovereignty and absolute revenge. Pay attention, because once the system deletes you, you never come back. The air in Sterling Croft's glass-enclosed penthouse smelled of cold ozone and expensive data. It was a sterile scent, the kind that only exists where billions of dollars are moved in silence, across fiber optic cables. Outside, the Austin skyline was a blurred tapestry of rain and neon. Inside, Sterling Croft sat behind a desk carved from a single slab of obsidian. He was a man who believed that morality was a variable in an equation he had already solved. He looked at the primary monitor. A single button centered on the screen was glowing with the soft green light of absolute power. The button was labeled Execute. Sterling leaned back. His silk shirt whispered against the leather of his chair. He was thinking about the history of the target. A historic university. A place built on sweat and sacrifice. A place that thought its endowment was protected by the sanctity of education. He smiled. He didn't see a university. He saw $500 million in liquidity that was about to become his personal plaything. He was a master of data extortion. He didn't steal. He simply used the law of the digital jungle to reclaim what he believed belonged to the strongest. The smart contract was a work of predatory art. It was designed to trigger a total asset transfer the moment a single interest payment was missed by 1 microsecond. The university hadn't missed it, but Sterling's servers had delayed their incoming wire just enough to create the legal fiction of a default. This was the sovereign move, a move that used the very infrastructure of the digital age to crush those who didn't understand it. Sterling's finger hovered over the mouse. He felt the thrill of a predator who has finally cornered a beast 10 times its size. He wasn't just taking money. He was taking a legacy. He was deleting a future. He clicked. The sound of the click was tiny, a plastic snap that echoed like a gunshot in the silent room. On the screen, a progress bar began to fill. It moved with the cold efficiency of an executioner's blade. 10%, 30%, 60%. Sterling watched the numbers drain from the university's accounts. 500 million, 400 million, 100 million. Zero. The room felt colder. Sterling laughed, a sharp, jagged sound that cut through the hum of the cooling fans. He thought he was the smartest man in the world. He thought he was untouchable because he owned the servers. He owned the code. He owned the secrets, but miles away, in a basement that didn't appear on any city map. Zoraidé Vance felt a sudden, heavy vibration against her chest. She didn't move. She didn't blink. She simply looked down at the vintage brass compass hanging from her neck. It was moving. The needle wasn't swinging toward the North Pole. It was vibrating with a violent, high-frequency intensity. It was locked onto a signature that Zoraidé had memorized a decade ago. A black server. A ghost machine. The very machine Sterling Croft was using to commit his crime. Zoraidé's skin was the color of a moonless night. Deep onyx, smooth and impenetrable. Her shock-white locks fell over her shoulders like frozen lightning. Her icy gray eyes were fixed on a wall of monitors that displayed the same code Sterling was currently celebrating. But she saw what he couldn't. She saw the sovereign key dot 10 years ago. When she was the lead cryptographer for the NSA, Zoraidé had been tasked with building the foundation for the world's most secure financial protocols. She had been told she was building a shield, but she realized they wanted a weapon. So she left. She was scrubbed from the records. She became a digital ghost architect. But before she vanished, she did something Sterling Croft would never understand. She wrote a ghost in the machine. Zoraidé reached up and touched the vintage brass compass. The cold metal felt like an anchor. She remembered the day she found it in a dusty shop in New Orleans. It was an item of history, an item that pointed the way for those who were lost. Now it was pointing the way to a thief. She adjusted. Black technor suit. The fabric was a minimalist masterpiece designed to absorb light. She was a shadow in a world of blinding data. She began to type. Her fingers moved across the keys with a rhythm that was more like music than mathematics. She wasn't fighting the code. She was speaking to it. She was reminding the code who its true mother was. Sterling Croft was still laughing in his penthouse. He was already drafting the press release about his newest acquisition. He was thinking about the prestige, the power. He didn't notice the tiny blue light on the top of his monitor. He didn't notice the lens of his webcam waking up from its forced slumber. He thought he was the observer. He didn't realize he had become the subject. Zoraidé watched him on her screen. She saw the arrogance in his eyes. She saw the way he dismissed the lives he had just ruined. She felt a cold, analytical calm. This wasn't about anger. This was about fiduciary duty. The university was her legacy. Her grandfather had been a dean there. Her mother had taught there. It was a sanctuary that Sterling Croft had tried to turn into a profit margin. She watched the progress bar on Sterling's screen reach 100%. The screen flashed a message. Transfer complete. Sterling clapped his hands together. A sound of triumph that would be the last happy sound he ever made. Zoraidé hit a single key on her console, on Sterling's screen. The message changed. It didn't say transfer complete anymore. It said protocol hijack initiated. Sterling froze. His laughter died in his throat. He leaned forward, his eyes squinting at the text. He tried to move the mouse. It wouldn't respond. He tried to hit the kill switch on his desk. It stayed dark. He began to panic. He grabbed his phone. No signal. He looked at the monitor again. The webcam light was now a steady, pulsing red, like a heartbeat. A voice began to come through his high-end speakers. It wasn't loud, but it carried the weight of an approaching storm. It was the voice of a woman who had lived in the shadows for a long time. Sterling Croft, you are a man who believes in the power of the click. You believe that if you can see it on a screen, you own it. You believe that data is your god. Sterling looked around the room. His breathing was shallow, ragged. Who is this? Show yourself. The voice continued, unfazed. My name is Zoraidé Vance. But to you, I am the sovereign key. 10 years ago, I wrote the code you just used to rob 100 years of history. I wrote the encryption. I wrote the backdoors. And I wrote the end of your empire on the screen. Sterling's face was replaced by a live feed of Zoraidé. Her white locks framed her dark face like a halo of judgment. Her icy gray eyes seemed to look right through him, right into the center of his cowardly heart. She held up the vintage brass compass. It was glowing with a faint blue light. You thought you were draining an endowment, Sterling, but you were actually opening a black server. A server that contains the records of every bribe, every extortion, and every illegal asset transfer you have ever made. While you were clicking execute, I was clicking recover. Sterling's face turned gray, the color of ash. He realized the trap wasn't the university. The trap was his own greed. He had reached for 100 million, and in doing so, he had handed over the keys to his entire billion-dollar kingdom. He tried to stand up, but his legs felt like lead. He looked at the webcam. He saw Zoraidé's finger hovering over a key. She spoke one last time. Her voice a cold whisper that echoed in the vast Empty office. Welcome to the void. Sterling. She hit the key. The screen went black. The lights in the penthouse flickered and died. The hum of the servers stopped. In the sudden, total silence, all Sterling could hear was the rain hitting the glass, and the sound of his own heart, terrified, alone, deleted. Sterling Croft sat in a room that was supposed to be the safest place on the planet. His office was a fortress of glass and silicon, a temple of modern intelligence. He had designed it that way. Every bolt in the frame and every line of code in the central nervous system was supposed to obey him. He was the master. He was the owner. But as the lights flickered and the steady hum of the climate control shifted into a low, aggressive drone, Sterling felt a coldness that had nothing to do with the temperature. The temperature was dropping rapidly. He could see his breath in the dim glow of the emergency lights. It was a thin, white mist that vanished as soon as it appeared. He stood up, his leather chair creaking like a dying animal. He moved toward the door, his footsteps echoing on the obsidian floor. He reached for the handle, sleek, biometric interface that usually recognized his fingerprint before he even touched it. The sensor turned red, a deep, blood-red light that filled the small space. The door didn't open. Instead, he heard the heavy, mechanical thud of the secondary deadbolts engaging. It was a sound of absolute finality, a sound that belonged in a high-security prison, not a billionaire's penthouse. He was locked in. The glass windows, usually transparent and inviting, now looked like sheets of black steel. He was trapped in a box of his own design. He pounded on the glass. The sound was muffled, swallowed by the sound-dampening materials he had insisted on. He looked at the walls. Every panel was a screen. Every screen was currently black. The silence was heavy. It felt like a physical weight pressing against his chest. He could feel his heart hammering against his ribs. A frantic, irregular rhythm. He was losing control. The smartest man in the world was suddenly a caged bird. Then the screens began to wake up. They didn't show the news. They didn't show the stock market. They didn't show the security feeds. They showed code, cascades of green and white characters flowing downward like digital rain. It moved with a terrifying velocity. It was beautiful and violent at the same time. Sterling backed away from the walls, his eyes darting from screen to screen. He knew this code. He recognized the syntax. It was the NSA-grade encryption he had spent years trying to crack. It was the foundation of his empire. But the code was changing. It was shifting, rearranging itself into shapes. On the massive 60-foot display behind his desk, the lines of code began to cluster. They formed the contours of a face. It wasn't a video. It was a living, breathing representation made entirely of data. Zoraidé Vance looked out at him from the machine. Her shock-white locks were rendered in strings of binary. Her deep onyx skin was represented by the dark voids between the characters. Her icy gray eyes were 2 points of blinding, high-frequency light. She looked more real than anything else in the room. Sterling gripped the edge of his desk. His knuckles were white. "Who are you? What have you done to my house?" His voice was thin, a ghost of the roar he usually used to command his boardrooms. Zoraidé didn't answer with words at first. Instead, the code on the screens shifted again. It displayed his private financial records, his offshore accounts, his secret property deeds. His entire life was being disassembled and reconstructed in front of him. She spoke. Her voice was everywhere. It came from the ceiling, the floor, the walls. It was the voice of the room itself. "I told you, Sterling. I am the ghost in the machine. I didn't break into your house. I built it. You bought the hardware. You paid the contractors. But you used the protocols I wrote 10 years ago to secure the soul of this building. You thought you were buying safety. You were actually buying a permanent seat at my table." Sterling shook his head. "That's impossible. Those protocols were vetted by the best security teams in the world. They said they were unbreakable. Zoraidé's digital face tilted to the side, a movement that was fluid and haunting. They were right. They are unbreakable. To anyone who doesn't have the sovereign key. I didn't leave a back door. Sterling, I left a front door that only responds to me. She raised her hand in the code stream. In her digital palm, he saw the representation of the vintage brass compass. It was glowing, vibrating in sync with the lights. In the room. Every server you own is currently screaming, Sterling. They are recognizing their creator. The 500 million you stole from the university was the final trigger. You didn't just take their money. You violated a smart contract that was protected by a legacy clause. A clause that identifies any attempt at hostile seizure as a terminal breach of fiduciary duty. Sterling's breathing was shallow. He was a man of logic, a man of systems, but the logic of this situation was leading to a single, terrifying conclusion. What legacy clause? I read every line of that contract. Zoraid's icy gray eyes flared. You read the lines you were meant to see. You didn't read the space between the characters. You didn't understand the sovereign move by executing that transfer. You didn't acquire the university. You admitted that you are an unfit custodian of your own assets. On the screens, the financial totals began to move, but they weren't increasing. They were being liquidated. Millions of dollars were being converted into digital tokens and sent to a series of untraceable ghost trusts. Stop it! Sterling screamed. He lunged for his keyboard, trying to input an override. The keyboard didn't respond. It sparked. Oh, a small, blue flash of electricity that sent a jolt of pain up his arm. He fell back, clutching his hand. His eyes wide with terror, Zoraidé watched him. Her expression was one of cold, cryptographic patience. It's too late. Sterling, the smart home you are so proud of is now a courtroom. And I am the judge, the jury, and the architect of your prison. You spent your life using data to extort others. You believed that secrets were the only currency that mattered. Now, you are finding out what happens when someone owns your secrets. The screens shifted again. They showed images of his childhood, his early crimes, the people he had stepped on to reach the top. It was a digital museum of his scenes. Every screen showed a different betrayal. Every pixel was a reminder of a life built on sand. Sterling looked at the face in the code. He saw the strength in her, the absolute authority. He realized he wasn't fighting a hacker. He was fighting a force of nature. A woman who had been erased by the world and had returned to rewrite it. Zoraidé Vance wasn't just a cryptographer. She was a guardian. She was the one who watched the watchers. She touched her vintage brass compass in the physical world. Miles away. The vibration was steady. It was a song of justice, a frequency that resonated through the very foundations of Croft's empire. The lights in the office began to pulse, slow, rhythmic, like a countdown. Sterling Croft sat on the floor of his obsidian office, surrounded by the light of 1,000 screens. He was a billionaire. He was a mogul. He was a titan. But in the presence of Zoraidé Vance, he was nothing but a string of corrupted data. A bug in a system that was finally being patched. He looked up at the digital face. Please, just tell me what you want. Zoraid's voice softened. But it didn't lose its edge. It became even more terrifying in its calm. I don't want anything from you, Sterling. I've already taken it. I am simply here to watch the system reset. I want you to feel the weight of the silence. I want you to understand that in a world of code, the only thing that is truly unhackable is integrity. And you, Sterling, are the most vulnerable man on Earth. The screens suddenly went white, a blinding, pure light that filled the room. Sterling covered his eyes, screaming dot when the light faded. The screens were black again. The room was silent. The door remained locked on the darkness. All he could see was the faint, pulsing red light of the webcam. The ghost was still there, and she was just getting started. 30,000 feet above the Atlantic Ocean, the Azure Serpent was a marvel of aerospace engineering. It was a $20 million private jet, a sanctuary of polished mahogany, cream leather, and silent, Vibrationless flight. Inside, Sterling Croft's inner circle was celebrating. They were the men who moved the money, the architects of his shadow empire. They drank scotch that cost more than a university professor's monthly salary. They laughed about the university endowment they had just liquidated. They thought they were flying above the law. They didn't realize that the law was already inside the cabin in her darkened command center. Zoraidé Vance watched the altitude indicator on her secondary monitor. It was a steady, unwavering line. She sat perfectly still. Her deep onyx skin was almost invisible in the low light. Only her shock-white locks and the icy gray intensity of her eyes gave her away. She was a silent observer of a crime that had already happened, and an execution that was about to begin. She felt the vintage brass compass around her neck. It was no longer vibrating. It was pulling, a heavy, magnetic draw toward the north. But the north was no longer a direction on a map for Zoraidé. North was justice. She looked at the digital blueprint of the Azure Serpent. It was a complex web of avionics and satellite links. Most people saw a plane. Zoraidé saw a mobile server, a flying data center that Sterling Croft used to bypass international banking regulations. He thought that by moving his transactions to the sky, he could outrun the reporting requirements of the Treasury Department. He was wrong. Zoraidé's fingers hovered over her obsidian keyboard. She wasn't looking for a way to crash the plane. She was looking for a way to crash the myth. She needed the system to reject him. Like a body rejecting a virus, she began the sequence. The first move was a ghost signal sent to the Federal Aviation Administration. It wasn't a manual report. It was an automated trigger. 10 years ago, when Zoraidé was designing the back end for the Global Financial Oversight Committee, she had installed a specific invisible protocol. She called it the Sovereign Echo Dot. It was a logic bomb designed to detect suspicious activity reports that were being suppressed by high-level corruption. If a certain threshold of laundered funds moved through a specific type of private shell company, the Sovereign Echo would bypass the human agents. It would go straight to the regulatory servers as an unalterable, high-priority alert. Sterling Croft had just crossed that threshold. On the screens, Zoraidé watched the code bloom. Thousands of pages of encrypted ledgers were being unspooled and fed into the FAA's compliance database. The documents proved that the Azure Serpent hadn't been bought with corporate profits. It had been purchased through a series of ghost trusts funded by the very endowment Croft had just stolen. It was a clear violation of the Bank Secrecy Act, a terminal breach of fiduciary duty. The report was flagged with a triple red priority back in the sky. The pilot of the Azure Serpent received a sudden, jarring message on his primary flight display. It wasn't a weather warning. It was a mandatory grounding order. The pilot's voice crackled over the internal comms. His tone was professional, but the edge of panic was unmistakable. "Sir, we have a situation. Our flight plan has been revoked by the FAA. We are being ordered to land at the nearest international airport for immediate federal inspection." Inside the cabin, the laughter died. Sterling Croft's lead attorney stood up, his face pale. "That's impossible. We have top-tier clearance. Tell them there's a mistake. Tell them who owns this plane." The pilot didn't respond, because the plane was no longer listening to the pilot. Zoraidé had engaged the autopilot override in her command center. Zoraidé watched the plane's flight path begin to curve. She wasn't just grounding him. She was delivering him. She had selected a specific airport, one where the local authorities were not on Croft's payroll, one where the federal agents were already waiting on the tarmac. She leaned back. The scent of old brass and cold silicon filled her lungs. This was the weight of institutional justice. It wasn't a punch to the face. It was a signature on a document. It was a line of code that stripped a man of his mobility, his status, and his freedom. Sterling Croft believed that money was the ultimate shield. He believed that if you were rich enough, you could live in a world without consequences. He had spent decades building a digital wall around his life. He thought he was the architect of that wall. He didn't realize that Zoraidé Vance was the one who had provided the stone. She watched him through the cabin's security camera. He was pacing, his hands shaking as he tried to call his contacts at the Department of Justice. But his phone was dead. Every satellite link associated with his tail number had been blacklisted. He was shouting into a void. He looked at the small camera lens in the corner of the ceiling. For a split second, his eyes met Zoraidé's icy gray stare across 1,000 miles of fiber optic cable. She didn't smile. She didn't gloat. She simply watched the altitude numbers drop. 20,000 feet, 15,000 feet, 10,000 feet. The azure serpent began its descent into the cold, gray light of the morning. Below them, the flashing lights of federal vehicles were already visible. They looked like a constellation of blue and red stars. A welcoming committee for a man who had forgotten that the ground always claims what belongs to it. Zoraidé touched the vintage brass compass. The metal was warm now. It felt like a heartbeat. She thought about the university, the students who would have lost their scholarships, the professors who would have lost their research, the legacy that would have been erased by a man who saw nothing but numbers. She felt a deep, ancient satisfaction. This was the work of a digital ghost. To remain unseen while making the invisible visible, she began. Part 2 of the leak. While the plane was landing, Zoraidé was broadcasting. She didn't send the documents to the news. She sent them to the investors, to the banks, to the people who provided the lifeblood of Croft's empire. She sent a summary of his terminal risk. She used the poison pillar clause to show them that their investments were now legally tied to a federal fraud investigation. In the world of Tier 1 finance, panic moves faster than light. Before the wheels of the plane even touched the runway, Sterling Croft's net worth had dropped by $400 million. The system was doing what she had designed it to do. It was correcting itself. It was purging the corruption. The azure serpent touched down. The reverse thrusters roared. A sound of mechanical surrender. Zoraidé watched as the federal agents swarmed the aircraft. She saw the door open. She saw Sterling Croft being led down the stairs. Not as a titan of industry, but as a man clutching a trash bag of his personal belongings. His arrogance had been replaced by a hollow, terrified vacancy. He looked around at the gray tarmac, at the cold wind whipping his expensive suit. He looked like a man who had just realized that the world he lived in was a dream. And Zoraidé Vance was the alarm clock. She closed the flight monitor. The first leak was complete. But the mission was far from over. Croft was on the ground, but his servers were still alive. His ghost trusts were still hidden. And his final move was yet to be revealed. Zoraidé stood up. Her black technor suit was a sharp, dark silhouette against the glowing screens. She adjusted her white locks. Her icy gray eyes were already focused on the next phase. Sterling Croft was grounded. Now it was time to erase him. Sterling Croft sat in a windowless holding room that smelled of industrial floor cleaner and cold. Metallic sweat. The walls were painted a dull, aggressive beige that seemed to absorb all sound. Outside the heavy steel door, he could hear the low murmur of federal agents, the sound of his own empire being dismantled in the hallway. He was no longer the Titan of Austin. He was no longer the master of the sky. He was a man in a cheap plastic chair, stripped of his watch, his phone, and his dignity. But Sterling Croft still had one card to play. He leaned forward, his eyes bloodshot and desperate. He looked at the small, cracked monitor on the table. It was the only piece of technology they had allowed him to touch, an older machine used for basic legal filings. To the agents, it was a relic. To Sterling, it was a terminal. He knew his encryption. He knew the hidden pathways through the global fiber optic grid. In his mind, he was already moving. He was bypassing the federal firewalls. He was reaching for the vault that no government could touch. The shadow ledger, $2 billion in liquid assets, stored in a black server hidden beneath a decommissioned salt mine in the Caribbean. It was his sovereign exit. The money he had set aside for the day the world finally tried to catch him. With $2 billion, he could buy a new name, a new face, and a new country. He could pay for a private army to extract him from this room. He just needed to enter the key. Sterling began to type. His fingers were shaking, but his muscle memory was precise. He entered the primary ghost protocol. The screen flickered. A dark command line interface appeared. It was a void of black and green. To anyone else, it looked like a system failure. To Sterling, it was the entrance to his sanctuary. He reached the final gate, the encryption lock. This was the masterpiece of his extortion career, a biometric and alphanumeric shield that he believed was unhackable. He had designed it to destroy itself if the wrong password was entered 3 times. It was a digital suicide vest. He prepared to enter the sequence, a complex string of characters based on his own private history. He took a deep breath. The air in the room felt thick, like he was breathing underwater. He hit the first key. Suddenly, the monitor emitted a sharp, high-pitched tone. Not the sound of an error, but the sound of a chime, a bell tolling for a funeral. On the screen, the cursor didn't move. Instead, a single line of text appeared in the center of the blackness. The sovereign key has been turned. Sterling's heart stopped. He stared at the words. The sovereign key. That was the phrase the voice on the plane had used. Zoraidé Vance, miles away, in the silent heart of her command center. Zoraidé sat in her black technor suit. The fabric was as dark as the shadows she inhabited. Her shock-white looks caught the blue light of the surrounding monitors, making her look like an ancient deity of logic. Her icy gray eyes were focused on a small window showing Croft's attempt to hack the system. She felt the vintage brass compass hanging from her neck. It was vibrating so hard it was humming against her collarbone. It wasn't pointing north. It was pointing directly at the digital coordinates of Croft's hidden Caribbean server. She had found it. She had been inside it for hours, while Croft was being processed by the feds. Zoraidé was rearranging his reality. She reached up and touched the brass casing of the compass. The metal was burning hot, a physical manifestation of the data flowing through her hands. She wasn't just a cryptographer. She was the architect of his ruin. She remembered the day she had been forced to write the original code for that salt mine server. They told her it was for national security. They lied. It was for greed. And today, she was taking her work back in the holding room. Sterling Croft began to sweat. He tried to delete the line of text. He tried to force a reboot. The machine ignored him. The screen shifted. The command line vanished. It was replaced by a single, glowing password prompt. Enter password to confirm asset seizure. Sterling's eyes bulged. Asset seizure. That wasn't his prompt. He looked at the password hint. It was a set of numbers .33.5933 north, 84.404 to west. Sterling stared at the coordinates. They felt familiar. A ghost of a memory from a document he had signed weeks ago. He realized with a jolt of pure primal terror what they were. Those were the geographic coordinates of the university he had just robbed. The very ground where the students were currently protesting his theft. The center of the campus he had tried to erase Zoraidé. Vance had changed the password to his entire life to the location of his crime. She was forcing him to acknowledge the place he had tried to destroy in order to save himself. It was a psychological checkmate, a moral trap that left him no room to breathe in the command center. Zoraidé spoke into her headset. Her voice was a low, melodic whisper, like the sound of a blade being sharpened. Do it, Sterling. Type in the coordinates. Type in the location of the people you thought were beneath you. Acknowledge the ground you tried to steal. Only then will you see where your $2 billion has gone. Sterling's hands hovered over the keyboard. He had no choice. The agents were coming back. He could hear their boots on the tile. He typed the numbers. 33.5933, 84.4042. It entered. The screen didn't open his account. It didn't show his billions. Instead, it showed a live video feed. It was a drone shot of the university campus. The sun was setting, casting long, golden shadows across the brick buildings. Thousands of students were gathered in the quad. They were cheering. They were crying. They were holding up their phones, glowing like a sea of stars. In the center of the crowd stood the university president. She was holding a tablet. She looked directly into the camera, as if she could see Sterling Croft in his beige room. She spoke. Her voice was amplified by the campus speakers. "We have just received an anonymous, irrevocable endowment. $500 million has been returned to our accounts. But that is not all. An additional $2 billion has been gifted to this institution via a sovereign trust. We are no longer just a university. We are now the most well-funded research center for digital sovereignty in the world." Sterling Croft let out a sound, a strangled, pathological whimper. $2 billion. Gone on the monitor. Zori's face appeared one last time, not as a code stream, but as a clear, high-definition image. Her deep onyx skin was luminous. Her icy gray eyes were filled with a cold. "Final piece. The money was never yours, Sterling. It was built on the backs of people like these. It was extracted through extortion and data theft. By the laws of fiduciary duty and the sovereign move, I have returned it to its rightful custodians. You didn't just lose your money. You funded your own replacement." She touched her vintage brass compass. The vibration stopped instantly. The needle fell silent. The door to the holding room swung open. The federal agents walked in. They were holding a new set of papers. "Sterling Croft, you are being charged with terminal fraud, money laundering, and high-level extortion. Your assets have been frozen by the Global Financial Oversight Committee. You have nothing left." Sterling looked at the agents, then back at the screen. The screen was black. Zoraidé Vance was gone. The digital ghost had finished her work. She stood up in her command center and walked toward the window. The rain had stopped. The city lights were reflecting in the puddles like diamonds. She felt the weight of the compass against her chest, a light, comforting weight. Now the university was safe. The thief was in a cage, and the sovereign key was back in her pocket. She adjusted her black suit, her white locks swaying with her movement. She looked out at the horizon. She knew there were others like Croft, other men who thought they could own the world with a click dot. She would be waiting for them. In the shadows, between the lines of code, "I am Zoraidé Vance," she whispered to the silent room. "And the ledger is finally balanced." The grand ballroom of the Venetian Silicon Summit was a cathedral of glass and cold blue light. It was a space designed to make billionaires feel like gods. The air was pressurized, filtered to remove the scent of the common world, leaving only the sterile smell of expensive cooling systems and the faint, metallic temps of high-frequency trading servers. 4,000 of the world's most powerful investors sat in the dark, their faces illuminated by the ghostly glow of their proprietary tablets. They were waiting for the prophet of the digital age. They were waiting for Sterling Croft. In the back of the hall, standing in a shadow that seemed to defy the theater's lighting, was Zoraidé Vance. She was a pillar of onyx and silver. Her black tech noir suit was a matte void, absorbing the blue spill from the stage. Her shock-white locks were pulled back, tight and disciplined, like a crown of frozen lightning. She stood perfectly still, her icy gray eyes scanning the room with the precision of a thermal camera. She didn't look at the stage. She looked at the faces of the investors. She saw the greed, the hunger, and the absolute trust they had placed in a man who was currently burning their futures to stay warm. Zoraidé reached into the pocket of her tailored jacket and closed her hand around the vintage brass compass. It was vibrating. The frequency was so high it felt like a living thing against her palm. It wasn't pointing north. It was locked onto the primary server rack beneath the stage, the black server where Croft kept his true ledger. She felt a cold, sharp satisfaction. This was the moment of the sovereign move, the moment where the ghost becomes the architect of a public execution. Sterling Croft walked onto the stage. The applause was deafening, a thunderous sound of 1,000 egos validating one another. He looked magnificent. He wore a suit made of crushed charcoal and confidence. He stood behind a podium that was nothing more than a sheet of smart glass, floating in the air. He raised his hands, and the room went silent, a silence born of fear and anticipation. He began to speak. His voice was like velvet over gravel, seductive and dangerous. He spoke about the future. He spoke about digital legacy. He spoke about the $500 million he had just acquired for his new venture. He didn't call it theft. He called it structural optimization. He looked into the camera, smiling at the millions watching the live stream. He thought he was untouchable. Zoraidé's fingers moved over a small obsidian device in her other hand. She wasn't just listening to his voice. She was monitoring the data packets flowing from his podium. She saw the encryption, the layers of fake security, the ghost protocols he thought would keep his private files hidden. He was about to show a demonstration of his new software, a program he claimed would revolutionize global banking. Zoraidé whispered a single word. Into the darkness, delete dot. She turned the sovereign key on the massive 300-foot screen behind Croft. The slick marketing presentation didn't just stop. It evaporated. It was replaced by a flickering green command line. The audience gasped, a collective intake of breath that sounded like a dying lung. Croft froze, his hand hovering over the smart glass. He tried to swipe, to reset, to force the system back into its cage. The system didn't obey. Instead, a folder appeared in the center of the screen. It was labeled Private. Beneath it, a sub-label appeared in blood-red text, Investor Asset Diversion Final Ledger. Croft's face went from tanned to the color of wet bone. He lunged for the podium, his fingers clawing at the glass. But Zoraidé had already locked his biometrics. He was a spectator in his own nightmare. Zoraidé watched from the shadows. She saw the pulse in his neck jumping, a frantic, visible throb. She saw the sweat beginning to break through his expensive makeup. She felt the weight of the compass in her hand, a heavy, grounding force. This was fiduciary duty. In its purest form, the private folder opened. The screen was suddenly filled with thousands of spreadsheets. They weren't just numbers. They were a roadmap of betrayal. The documents showed a decade of systematic theft. They showed how Croft had been skimming 7% from every Tier 1 investor to fund his private ghost trusts in the Cayman Islands. They showed the shell companies, the fake offshore entities, and the forged signatures. But the killing blow was the Section 1031 exchange fraud. The screen projected a high-resolution scan of a document Croft had signed only 3 hours ago. It was a transfer of the university's stolen $500 million into his personal holding company, using an expired land lease as collateral. It was a terminal breach of law, a federal crime committed in real time, in front of the very people he had robbed. The ballroom erupted, but not with applause. It was the sound of 1,000 predators realizing they were the prey. The investors stood up, their faces twisted in rage. The tablets in their hands began to beep, frantic alerts from their own legal teams who were watching the feed. Croft looked out at the crowd. His mouth was open, but no sound came out. He looked like a man who had forgotten how to speak. He looked at the screen, then at the security team rushing the stage. But they weren't there to protect him. They were there to serve the first of 100 warrants. Zoraidé's icy gray eyes never left the stage. She saw the exact moment Croft realized he was done. It wasn't when the files appeared. It was when he saw the logo at the bottom of the screen, a small brass compass icon. She spoke, her voice a cold, internal monologue that only the silence could hear. You thought the world was a playground for the clever, Sterling. You thought that if you built a wall of code high enough, you could hide the bodies of the people you stepped on. You forgot one thing. The code has a memory, and I am that memory. She adjusted her black technor suit, smoothing the fabric over her shoulder. She felt the internal shift of a mission approaching its end. This wasn't just about Croft, it was about the system. It was about reminding the elite that their power is a loan, and the interest is finally due. The screens shifted one last time. They didn't show the files anymore. They showed a live map of Croft's accounts. Every dollar, every cent was being drained in real time. The numbers were spinning backward. A digital countdown to zero. The sovereign key was reversing the flow, sending the stolen billions back to the pension funds, the universities, and the small investors he had crushed. Institutional justice wasn't a slow process today. It was a digital avalanche. Zoraide turned away from the stage. She began to walk toward the exit, her footsteps silent on the thick carpet. She didn't need to see the handcuffs. She didn't need to hear the sentencing. She had already written the ending as she pushed open the heavy mahogany doors to the street. The cold night air hit her face. It smelled of rain and ozone. It was a clean smell. The city felt different, lighter, as if a heavy weight had been lifted from its shoulders. She reached up and touched the vintage brass compass. It was still now. The needle was pointing north, back to the center of her own quiet luxury, back to the shadows where she belonged. The digital ghost architect had finished her work. The public stripping was over, and the world was a little more honest than it had been an hour ago. Zoraidé Vance disappeared into the neon fog of the city, a shadow among shadows, leaving the elite to sift through the ruins of their shattered god. The rain in Boston felt like cold needles against the pavement. Zoraidé Vance stood at the threshold of Croft Plaza, a monolith of glass and arrogance. She didn't carry a weapon. She carried a legacy. The storm was loud, but the silence in Zoraidé's mind was absolute. She adjusted her matte black technoir suit. The fabric was engineered to absorb light, just as she had been engineered to absorb secrets. Her shock-white locks were damp, hanging over her deep onyx skin like strands of silver moonlight. She reached up and touched the vintage brass compass hanging from her neck. It was vibrating, low, persistent hum that resonated against her collarbone. It wasn't pointing north. It was locked onto the primary server room 99 floors above her. The black server, the heart of Sterling Croft's stolen empire. Zoraide stepped forward. The heavy glass doors of the plaza slid open with a hiss of pressurized air. The lobby was a cathedral of corporate vanity. 50-foot ceilings, white marble floors that looked like frozen clouds. The scent of ozone and expensive cologne hung in the air. A sterile, empty smell. At the center of the hall stood the security checkpoint. For men in charcoal suits, ex-military, they were trained to spot threats before they happened. They saw a woman walking toward them with the grace of a panther and the coldness of a glacier. They didn't see a threat. They saw a trespassor. The lead guard stepped forward, his hand resting on his hip, near his holster. "This is private property, ma'am. You're in the wrong building." Zoraidé didn't stop. She didn't look at him. Her icy gray eyes were fixed on the biometric scanner at the end of the corridor. Her footsteps didn't make a sound on the marble. "I said, stop." The guard moved to block her path. His voice was a bark, designed to intimidate. Zoraide halted. She was inches from him. She was shorter, but she felt like the taller person in the room. She looked up at him. Her icy gray eyes seemed to read the code in his DNA. "I am not in the wrong building." Zoraide spoke. Her voice was a low, heavy velvet. It carried the weight of a countdown. "I am simply returning home." The guard laughed, a short, sharp sound that echoed in the vast lobby. "This is Croft Plaza. Sterling Croft owns the air you're breathing right now, unless you have an appointment. You have 10 seconds to turn around." Zoraide looked at her vintage brass compass. The vibration was getting stronger. She looked back at the guard. "Sterling Croft doesn't own this building. He simply pays the electricity bill. He is a tenant who forgot to read the fine print." She walked past him. The guards lunged. 2 of them reached for her arms. Zoraide didn't fight. She didn't need to. She simply placed her hand on the biometric iris scanner as she moved. The machine emitted a soft, blue light. It scanned the deep onyx contours of her face. It mapped the unique, high-frequency patterns in her icy gray eyes. This was the scanner Croft bragged about at every tech summit. He claimed it was unhacked. He claimed it was the ultimate wall. He forgot that Zoraidé Vance wrote the kernel logic for that scanner 10 years ago, on the massive security monitors above the desk. The red nitroxis warning began to flicker. The system was fighting itself. It was recognizing a ghost. It was seeing the digital ghost architect, who had built the very foundation of Croft's security. Zoraidé closed her eyes for a microsecond. In her mind, she could see the code, a cascade of green and white light flowing through the building's nervous system. She turned the sovereign key in her mind. The system surrendered. The red lights on the monitors vanished. They were replaced by a brilliant, royal gold, a mechanical voice, smooth and devoid of emotion, echoed through the lobby. Biometric match confirmed. Identity verified. Welcome back, owner. The security guards froze. Their hands were still on Zoraidé's shoulders, but they let go as if her suit had suddenly turned into white-hot metal. They looked at the monitors, then at the woman standing between them. Access granted. The screen flashed clearance. Level sovereign. The lead guard's face turned the color of ash. There's a mistake. The system is glitched. Sterling Croft is the only owner in the database. Zoraidé turned to face him. Her expression was one of cold, cryptographic patience. Sterling Croft owns Croft Holdings. Croft Holdings is a subsidiary of a shell company named Vane Sterling. Vane Sterling is owned by a ghost trust, and I am the sole trustee of that trust. She leaned in, her voice a whisper that felt like a blade. Sterling Croft is a manager. I am the institution. Move. The guard stepped aside. He didn't have a choice. The building was no longer obeying his orders. It was obeying hers. The elevators at the end of the hall opened automatically. They were waiting for her. Zoraidé walked into the lift. It was lined with gold leaf and obsidian. The doors closed, cutting off the sight of the confused guards. As the elevator began its silent, high-speed ascent, Zoraidé felt the vintage brass compass heat up. The vibration was a steady pulse now, like a heartbeat. She was no longer just a cryptographer. She was a sovereign. In the world of Tier 1 finance, possession is 9/10 of the law. But in the world of Zoraidé Vance, information is the entire law. Sterling Croft thought he had stolen a university's future. He didn't realize he had accidentally triggered a litigation clause that had been dormant for a decade. A clause that transferred the beneficial ownership of every asset he owned to the woman he had tried to erase. The elevator chimed. Floor 99. Zoraidé stepped out into a hallway that smelled of expensive materials and old secrets. She could see Sterling Croft's office at the end of the hall. The lights were on. He was still there, celebrating his theft. She felt a cold, analytical calm. This wasn't about revenge. This was about fiduciary duty. The world was out of balance, and Zoraidé Vance was the only one who could correct the equation. She walked toward the office. Every step was a line of code being rewritten. Every breath was a system reset. Sterling Croft was about to find out what happens when you try to bankrupt a legacy. You don't just lose your money. You lose your identity. Zoraidé Vance was home, and the eviction was just beginning. The boardroom of Sterling. Croft's primary investment bank was a sanctuary of silence and absolute order. The walls were paneled in rare, silver-gray ash that seemed to absorb the very light from the floor-to-ceiling windows. Outside, the world was a blurred tapestry of rain and city lights. Inside, the temperature was kept at a precise 68 degrees, creating a sterile environment where only cold, hard numbers survived. The scent of black coffee and expensive stationery hung in the air, mixing with the faint, electrical ozone of the high-speed fiber cables. Running beneath the floorboards, Sterling Croft sat at the head of the obsidian table, feeling the weight of the universe in his pocket. He was a man who believed that debt was for the weak and credit was a birthright for the brilliant. He was checking his phone. waiting for the confirmation of the university's total collapse. He didn't see a tragedy. He saw a ledger that was finally becoming balanced in his favor. He was smiling. Shh. Predatory expression that didn't reach his eyes. Then his phone didn't chime. It vibrated with a long, continuous pulse that felt like a warning dot in a secure facility 300 miles away. Zoraidé Vance sat in her matte black tech noir suit. Her deep onyx skin was illuminated by the soft blue glow of 14 different banking interfaces. Her shock white locks were pulled back, exposing the razor-sharp focus in her icy gray eyes. She wasn't typing anymore. She was watching. She was the conductor of a silent symphony of financial destruction. She reached up and touched the vintage brass compass hanging from her neck. It was vibrating so hard it felt like it was humming against her skin. It was locked onto the black server Croft used to mask his personal debt-to-income ratio. Zoraidé didn't need to break into the banks. She simply needed to remind the banks who they were dealing with. She triggered the sovereign key in exactly 30 seconds. The world of Sterling Croft was going to become a vacuum at the bank's central risk assessment hub. An automated alarm began to scream across the internal network. It wasn't a fire alarm. It was a terminal risk alert. The system had detected a paradox in Croft's liquidity, a paradox that Zoraidé had carefully planted 10 years ago within the foundational code of the bank's risk modeling software. She had labeled it the sovereign default trigger. The logic was simple and absolute. If Croft ever attempted to move stolen assets, like the university endowment, the code would automatically link his personal accounts to a century-old fiduciary breach statute. Under international banking protocols, a terminal breach meant all credit facilities were to be revoked immediately to protect the institution's solvency. Sterling Croft watched the screen on his phone. The green bars of his credit lines began to flicker. 100 million, gone 500 million, gone. His heart skipped a beat. A cold, sharp sensation that radiated down his left arm. He tried to refresh the app. It crashed. He looked at the bank's CEO across the table. The CEO was staring at his own tablet, his face turning the color of wet parchment. Sterling. The CEO's voice was a whisper. What is this? My system just flagged your entire portfolio as a black swan event. Croft didn't answer. He couldn't. He watched as his total available credit hit 0 in her command center. Zoraidé watched the progress bar hit 100%. She felt a deep, analytical tom. This was the weight of institutional justice. It wasn't a physical blow. It was the removal of the air a predator needs to breathe. She looked at the vintage brass compass. The vibration slowed to a steady, comforting throb. She spoke. Her voice a low velvet thread in the silent room. The margin call. It's arrived, Sterling, and you are short on everything that matters in the boardroom. Croft lunged for his laptop, his fingers frantic and clumsy. He was trying to move funds from his offshore ghost trusts to cover the margin. He was a master of data extortion. He thought he could outrun the math. He didn't realize that the math had been rewritten by the woman he tried to erase. The screen displayed a single, high-definition image. It wasn't his bank balance. It was the geographic coordinates of the university. Campus Zoraidé had locked his wealth behind a T, sovereign deed, to access even 1 cent. Croft would have to admit in writing that he was a trustee of the very university he was trying to destroy. It was a checkmate of legal and digital proportions. He didn't just lose his money. He lost the ability to pretend he was a legitimate businessman. Sterling Croft fell back into his chair. The silence in the room was now absolute. The ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner sounded like a hammer against his skull. Every bank he used was now a closed door. Every credit line was a dead wire. In 30 seconds, he had gone from a titan of the tech noir age to a man who couldn't pay for the coffee on the table. He looked at the CEO. The CEO stood up. Not as a friend, but as a creditor. Sterling, the bank is seizing the building. We are seizing the servers. Your personal liability is now total. Zoraidé Vance stood up in her command center. Her black suit was a sharp silhouette against the glowing screens. She adjusted her white locks, her icy gray eyes already focused on the next phase. The thief was grounded. Now it was time to strip him of his name. The sovereign move was nearly complete. And Zoraidé was the only one who knew how the story ended. The temperature in Sterling Croft's private server vault had dropped to a lethal 40 degrees. A deliberate, technical frost designed to keep the world's most powerful processors from melting under the heat of their own greed. The air tasted of ozone and expensive, recycled carbon. It was a sterile scent, the kind that only exists in places where human life is secondary to data. Sterling Croft stood in the center of the room, his bespoke charcoal suit absorbing the blue glow of the server racks. He looked like a king standing in a temple of silicon. He was smiling, a sharp, predatory expression that didn't reach his eyes. His finger hovered over a touch-sensitive panel. He was seconds away from executing the final phase of the smart contract, a contract that would drain the $500 million endowment of a historic university and funnel it into his private ghost. Trust he didn't see the thousands of students who would lose their scholarships. He didn't see the centuries of history he was about to delete. He only saw the numbers. He only saw the victory. He thought he was the smartest man in the room because he owned the room. But Zoraidé Vance was already standing in his blind spot. She was a shadow among shadows. Her deep onyx skin was almost invisible against the matte black walls of the vault. Only her shock white locks and the icy gray intensity of her eyes gave her away. She wore a minimalist technoir suit. The fabric didn't reflect the blue light. It swallowed it. She stood with a cold, analytical patience. The kind of patience only a woman who has spent 10 years planning a reset can possess. Zoraidé felt a heavy, rhythmic vibration against her chest. She didn't move her head. She simply looked down at the vintage brass compass hanging from her neck. It wasn't pointing north. It was vibrating with a high-frequency intensity that signaled a black server was active within 5 feet. This was Croft's pride, his unhackable heart. Sterling Croft turned, sensing a shift in the air. "Who are you?" "Security." "Get in here." Zoraidé didn't move. Her voice was a low, heavy velvet that carried more weight than Croft's billion-dollar architecture. "The security team isn't coming, Sterling. Their biometric scanners were updated 5 minutes ago. Currently, they are being told that you are the intruder, and I am the owner of this building." Croft laughed, a jagged, arrogant sound. "You're a ghost. I scrubbed your name from the NSA records myself. You don't exist." Zoraidé stepped into the blue light. Her icy gray eyes locked onto his. "I am a ghost, Sterling, and I built the machine you're standing in 10 years ago. I wrote the foundational code for the very smart contract you're about to execute. I didn't write it to be a weapon for men like you. I wrote it to be a shield for people like them." She reached up and touched the brass casing of her compass. The vibration stopped. The needles suddenly spun, locking onto the monitor behind Croft. Croft sneered, his finger pressing the execute button. "Too late, the transfer is already initiated. The money is gone." Zoraidé didn't flinch. She watched the progress bar on the screen. It was moving with a cold. Digital efficiency, 90%. 95%. You forgot one thing, Sterling. Every masterpiece has a signature. In the world of cryptography, it is called a sovereign key, a piece of code that exists between the lines, invisible to anyone who didn't write the language. She pulled a small, obsidian-cased drive from her pocket and slotted it into a hidden port near the floor. The room suddenly hummed with a deep, subsonic frequency. The blue lights on the server racks turned a violet, pulsing red. On the main monitor, the progress bar stopped at 99%. Croft lunged for the screen, hitting the override. "What is this? Why isn't it completing?" Zoraidé's voice was a cold countdown. "It's called a protocol hijack. By trying to execute a predatory loan against a nonprofit entity, you triggered the legacy clause I hid in the kernel a decade ago. It identifies any attempt at hostile asset seizure as a terminal breach of fiduciary duty." On the screen, The text began to rewrite itself. The words transfer to Croft Holdings were deleted. In their place, a new command appeared. Reciprocal asset restoration. Croft's face turned the color of ash. Reciprocal. What does that mean? It means the contract is reversing. Zoraidé spoke, her eyes reflecting the scrolling red code. But it isn't just returning the university's money. It is identifying the source of the attack. She hit a single key on her handheld device. The sovereign key is a mirror, Sterling, because you tried to bankrupt a legacy. The system is now identifying your personal fortune as the collateral for the damage you intended to cause. You didn't just fail to get their money. You just signed over your entire billion-dollar net worth to the university endowment. Croft began to scream, hitting the monitors with his fists. Stop it. That's my money. That's my life. Zoraidé watched him with a detached, cryptographic.com. She felt the pulse in her own throat. Steady and slow. This was the moment of the checkmate. The moment where the arrogant elite find out that the infrastructure they rely on was never theirs to own. On the screens, the numbers were spinning backward. Millions, then billions, were being drained from Croft's offshore accounts. The system was following the poison pillar logic she had designed. Every offshore shell company, every ghost trust, every secret ledger was being unspooled and fed into the university's accounts. Croft fell to his knees. The sterile smell of the room was now replaced by the metallic scent of burning circuits. The servers were working at maximum capacity to execute the total liquidation of his life. Zoraidé walked toward him, her footsteps silent on the cold metal floor. She looked down at him, her white locks swaying. You thought you were the architect, Sterling, but you were just a tenant in a house I built. You thought secrets were power. But the truth is the only currency that never devalues. Today, the university receives a $2 billion donation, and you receive the only thing you truly earned. Nothing. The vibration in her vintage brass compass started again, but it was light, a soft, purring sound. The progress bar hit 100%. A final message flashed on the screen. It was in a font that looked like old-fashioned typewriter ink. Legacies are built, not bought. Zoraidé turned her back on Croft, leaving him in the cold, red glow of his own failure. She walked out of the vault, her black suit merging with the darkness of the hallway. Outside, the rain was still falling, but it felt cleaner. The weight of the secret she had carried for 10 years was gone. The university would be safe. Those students would have their futures. And the digital ghost architect was once again invisible. She adjusted the brass compass around her neck, her icy gray eyes focused on the horizon. The sovereign key was back in her pocket, and the world was finally balanced. The darkness in the 99th floor penthouse was not just the absence of light. It was the absence of a future. Sterling Croft stood in the center of the obsidian floor, his breath hitching in the cold air. The rain outside was a rhythmic drumbeat against the glass, a constant reminder that the natural world still existed while his digital world was being deleted. He was alone. The silence was heavy. It felt like a physical weight pressing against his throat. A silence born of total systemic rejection. The scent of cold ozone and expensive leather filled the room. Sterling felt the sweat cooling on his forehead, turning into a thin layer of ice. He reached for the encrypted smartphone on his desk. It was a $5,000 piece of hardware, a device he believed made him a god among men. He gripped it so hard his knuckles turned white against the charcoal leather. He needed a voice. He needed the police. He needed the very authorities he had spent a lifetime bribing and bypassing. He pressed the emergency override. The screen flared to life. Not with the standard dialer. Not with the signal bars he expected. Instead, a single line of white text appeared against a black void. You don't exist in the system. Anymore. Sterling stared at the screen, his thumb hovering over the glass. He didn't understand. He was Sterling Croft. He was a billionaire. He was the architect of the digital infrastructure that half the country relied on. He tried to force a reboot. He tried to access the satellite link. The screen flickered. Second message replaced the first. Identity not found. Social security number, void passport. Canceled bank accounts non-existent. Sterling Croft began to tremble. A deep, visceral shaking that started in his knees and moved up to his chest. He wasn't just losing his money, he was being erased. This was the work of Zoraidé Vance, the woman who built the unhackable servers he had tried to weaponize. She wasn't just taking his assets, she was stripping him of his humanity. In a world of digital sovereignty, if you are not in the system, you are a ghost. Across the city, in a command center buried deep beneath the limestone of the hill country, Zoraidé Vance sat perfectly still. Her deep onyx skin was a matte shadow against the glow of her monitors. Her shock white locks hung over her shoulders like strands of silver light. She was the only thing moving in the room. Her icy gray eyes scanning the final lines of the sovereign key protocol. She reached up and touched the vintage brass compass. It was silent now. The needle wasn't moving. The black server Croft had used to hide his extortion records was gone. It hadn't just been hacked, it had been deleted. Every byte of data, every secret ledger, every predatory smart contract. All of it had been sucked into the void she had created. Zoraidé felt a cold, sharp satisfaction. This was the fiduciary duty of a ghost. To protect the legacy of those who cannot protect themselves. To ensure that the institutional greed of men like Croft met an absolute, immovable wall. She watched Sterling Croft through his own webcam. The red light was pulsing, a digital heartbeat. She saw him try to call his lead attorney. She saw the panic in his eyes as the phone displayed the same message over and over. Record not found. Zoraidé leaned back in her chair, her black technoir suit creaking softly. She was thinking about the history of the university, the years of sacrifice, the teachers who had taught her. The legacy Croft had tried to turn into a profit margin. She had used the very encryption she designed for the NSA to create a legal and digital vacuum around him. This wasn't just litigation. This was a sovereign move. She had triggered the void ABNETO protocol. In the world of high-level cryptography, it meant a total reset. By executing the theft of the university endowment, Croft had triggered a terminal risk alert she had hidden in the code 10 years ago, an alert that automatically classified him as a systemic threat. The system was now treating him like a virus. It was isolating him, deleting his credentials, removing his access to the global grid. Sterling Croft lunged for the landline, a copper wire backup he kept for emergencies. He picked up the receiver. There was no dial tone, only a recording. The individual you are trying to reach has been removed from the database. Please disconnect. Sterling dropped the phone, the plastic hitting the obsidian floor with a hollow, echoing crack. He looked at the windows. He could see the lights of the city. Thousands of people living their lives, moving through the systems he used to own. He was the owner of the building. But the biometric scanner at the door didn't know him. He was a billionaire. But the banks didn't recognize his name. He was a man without a signature. He looked at the webcam again. He knew she was watching. He knew Zoraidé was there. Somewhere in the shadows, trolling the very air he was breathing. "Zoraidé!" he screamed, the sound of his voice raw and desperate. "Zoraidé, talk to me. Tell me what you want." Zoraidé watched the screen. Her expression didn't change. She didn't want anything from him. She had already taken everything that mattered. She had taken his power. She had taken his identity. She had taken his voice. She whispered into her headset, her voice a low thread of silver in the dark. "The system doesn't want anything from you, Sterling. The system has simply forgotten you. This is the price of trying to own the soul of an institution." This is the final silence. She hit the final key on her console in the penthouse. The monitors turned off. The phone went black. The backup generators died. Sterling Croft was left in total, absolute darkness. The only sound was the rain and the beating of his own terrified heart. Zoraidé Vance stood up. She smoothed the fabric of her matte black suit. She reached for her vintage brass compass and felt the metal cooling. The job was done. The university was safe. The thief was erased. She walked toward the exit of her command center, her white locks swaying with each step. She was a shadow among shadows, a digital ghost who had finally balanced the ledger. Sterling Croft would spend the rest of his life trying to prove he existed. He would find that every door was locked. Every account was empty. Every record was blank. He would walk the streets of a city he used to own, and no one would know his name. This was the sovereign revenge of Zoraidé Vance. She stepped out into the night, her icy gray eyes reflecting the stars. The world was moving forward, and she was once again invisible. The 99th floor was no longer a sanctuary of power. It was a tomb of silence. Sterling Croft stood paralyzed in the center of the room. The blue glow of the monitors had faded into a cold, sickly gray. The rain against the glass was the only thing moving in his world. He looked at his hands. They were trembling. He was a man who had built an empire on the theft of other people's futures. Now he was discovering that his own future had been liquidated in less than 60 seconds. The air in the office was thick with the scent of electrical fire and scorched ozone. It was the smell of a digital death. Sterling looked toward the obsidian desk. He wanted to reach for the phone. He wanted to call for help. But he knew the lines were dead. He knew the satellite was blind. He was a ghost in his own fortress. In the corner of the room, Zoraidé Vance moved with the fluid grace of a shadow. Her deep onyx skin was a matte void against the chrome fixtures. Her shock-white locks caught the dim emergency light, making her look like a guardian from a myth that the modern world had forgotten. She stood with her arms crossed. Her icy gray eyes were fixed on Croft with a detached cryptographic.com. She wasn't angry. She was finished. She reached up and touched the vintage brass compass hanging from her neck. It was still vibrating, a low, rhythmic thrum that told her the black server beneath the floor was making its final surrender. It was the heartbeat of a dying machine. The heavy, double doors of the office swung open. Sterling Croft turned, hope flickering in his eyes for a microsecond. He expected his personal security detail. He expected men with guns who would remove this woman from his sight. He expected the world to return to the way it was. For men in charcoal tactical suits stepped into the room. They were the men Croft had handpicked from the elite units of the world. They were paid 3 times the market rate to ensure his absolute safety. They were the walls he had built around his life. Sterling pointed a shaking finger at Zoraidé. "Get her out of here. Arrest her. Use whatever force is necessary. She has compromised the central grid." The guards didn't move. They didn't look at Zoraidé. They looked at the tablets on their wrists. The lead guard stepped forward. He didn't reach for his holster. He reached for the biometric scanner on the wall. He looked at Sterling. His face was a mask of cold. It's professional detachment. The guard's voice was like ice. "Mr. Croft, you are in violation of the building's new security protocol. Your access has been revoked by the majority shareholder of Vane Sterling Holdings." Sterling's mouth fell open. A sound of strangled confusion escaped his throat. "I am the owner. I pay your salaries." The guard looked at his screen. The payroll for this unit was just transferred to a legacy trust in New Orleans. "Our contracts are now managed by Zoraidé Vance. Your authorization code has been flagged as a terminal risk." Sterling Croft looked at Zoraidé. "You bought them." "With my own money." Zoraidé stepped forward. Her footsteps were silent on the obsidian floor. "She didn't buy them. Sterling, the system did. By attempting to bankrupt the university. You triggered a fiduciary clawback provision that I wrote into your corporate bylaws 10 years ago. You didn't read the fine print. You were too busy looking for the next person to rob." She turned toward the door. The guards moved instantly. They stepped behind Sterling, one on each side. Their movements were synchronized and absolute. They didn't use handcuffs. They didn't need to. The total removal of his power was a stronger restraint than steel. Please escort the former manager from the premises. Zoraide spoke. Her voice was a low velvet thread that filled the empty room. He no longer has a seat at this table. Sterling Croft was led toward the door. He didn't fight. He looked like a man who had forgotten how to walk. His expensive charcoal suit was wrinkled. His hair was a mess. He looked like a beggar who had wandered into a palace and been caught. He was led through the lobby he used to own, past the scanners that no longer recognized his face. The elevator doors opened. He was taken to the roof. The helipad was a vast, rain-streaked circle of concrete. The wind was howling across the Austin skyline. The lights of the city were flickering in the storm, like a dying code. Zoraide stood at the edge of the helipad. Her black tech noir suit was a sharp silhouette against the gray sky. She watched the city she had just saved. Sterling Croft was brought to the center of the circle. A black helicopter was waiting. Its blades were spinning, creating a deafening, rhythmic roar that swallowed his voice. The lead guard leaned into Sterling's ear. Your transport to the Federal Processing Center is ready. Your flight plan is unalterable. You are no longer on the grid, Mr. Croft. Sterling looked at Zoraide one last time. He wanted to say something. He wanted to find a way to hack his way back into existence. But as he looked into her icy gray eyes, he saw the end. He saw a ledger that was finally balanced. He was forced into the helicopter. The door slid shut. The machine lifted into the air. Disappearing into the clouds and the rain, Zoraidé Vance stood alone on the roof. The wind whipped her shock-white locks. But she didn't move. She felt a sudden, total stillness. She looked down at her vintage brass compass. The vibration had stopped. The needle was no longer spinning. It was no longer pulling toward the black server. It was pointing north. A true, steady north. The digital ghost had been exorcised. The Croft name was being deleted from the global grid in real time. Every bank account, every property deed, every encrypted secret. It was all being overwritten by the university's endowment data. By tomorrow morning, the world would look for Sterling Croft and find nothing but a series of expired links and deleted files. Zoraide reached into the pocket of her suit and pulled out a small, old-fashioned fountain pen. It had belonged to her grandfather, the man who had helped build the university. She looked at the pen, then at the skyline. Institutional justice is not a quick process. She whispered to the wind, but it is absolute. She turned and walked toward the stairs. She didn't look back at the empty helipad. She didn't look back at the office. She was no longer a digital ghost architect. She was the matriarch, the woman who watched the world from the shadows to ensure the light never went out. The ledger was closed. The sovereign key was secure. And the matriarch's will was done.